There is a quiet moment, often late at night, when the world finally loosens its grip and you are left alone with the weight you carry. It is there, in the stillness between one breath and the next, that something in you hears a call you did not expect. Not a loud voice, not a dramatic sign, but a subtle inner recognition. This is not just tiredness. This is something else, in Jungian language. Such a moment can be understood as a small act of synchronicity, an outer situation that mysteriously lines up with an inner need. You did not arrive here by accident. Some deeper layer of your psyche has brought you to this threshold because it is time to see what has long remained hidden. For years, perhaps decades, you have lived under a particular spell, the requirement to be strong alone. On the outside, it looks like competence, like reliability, like the woman who always knows what to do when everyone else is falling apart. On the inside, it feels like a nameless heaviness. Not the fatigue that disappears with sleep, but a kind of existential weight, as if you have been holding up the ceiling of your own life with your bare hands for so long that your bones ache. You have searched everywhere for remedies. You have changed routines, read books, taken advice, tried to optimize your mind and body. Yet the core burden does not move. It remains, like a stone at the center of your chest. Carl Jung would say that when a problem refuses to yield to effort and strategy, we are no longer dealing with the surface ego alone. We are in the territory of the unconscious. The unconscious is not just a dark basement of repressed memories. It is also the larger field of psychic life that shapes us from below the threshold of awareness. It does not respond well to force. It responds to attention, meaning, and truth. The exhaustion you feel is not only physical, it is symbolic. It is the psyche's way of saying you have been living one story. There is another story underneath it, waiting to be remembered. To understand that story, we must begin where your strength began. Not in adulthood, when people started praising you for being so capable, but much earlier. When your nervous system made a silent vow on your behalf. Maybe you were 7 years old, sitting in a kitchen where adults argued and never asked how you were. Maybe you were 15, closing your bedroom door on the sound of someone else's chaos. There comes a moment when a child realizes, often without words, that the emotional adults are not going to truly hold her. They are nearby, perhaps physically present, paying bills, cooking meals, upholding appearances, but emotionally, they exist on a distant shore, speaking a language she cannot reach. In Jungian terms, this is one face of what is called the negative mother complex. A complex is not an insult. It is a cluster of memories, feelings, and expectations organized around a core experience. The mother complex in particular forms around the early encounters with the feminine principle, the energy that is meant to nurture, contain, and reflect the child's being back to her. When that presence is absent, chaotic, needy, or emotionally inverted, when the child becomes the one who listens, comforts, stabilizes, the pattern reverses. The harbor becomes the ship, and the ship becomes the harbor. The child begins to hold what was meant to hold her. In that reversal, a crucial sentence takes root in the psyche. I am the one who has to hold this together. You did not choose this. It was not a conscious decision. It was a brilliant adaptive response of a young psyche that could not afford to collapse. Vulnerability in such an environment becomes dangerous. Tears feel useless. Asking for help feels humiliating. And so, slowly, the child learns another language: problem solving, emotional management, composure. She becomes the calm one, the steady one, the one who senses the moods of others before they even arrive and adjusts herself accordingly. What begins as survival hardens over time into identity. Jung called this outer adaptation the persona, the social mask we develop to function in the world, to fit into our family, culture, and expectations. For most people, the persona is something they can take on and off the work self, the friend self, the family self. For you, the persona fused with the skin. The strong one is not just a role you play, it is who you believe you are. Others confirm it, They come to you in crises, tell you they admire your resilience, lean on your capacity. They rarely ask what it costs you. Over time, even you forget to ask. You simply keep carrying. And yet, your deeper psyche has not forgotten. It remembers the small one inside who never got to be held. It remembers the terror beneath the competence. It remembers that your strength was not born from freedom, but from necessity. This remembrance is what is now pressing up through your exhaustion, through the symptoms your body has begun to express. Something in you refuses to keep the old bargain. Something in you is done. There comes a moment when the body speaks the truth the mind has silenced for years. It begins subtly an ache that drifts from shoulder to hip, a fatigue that sleep cannot touch, a restless vigilance that keeps the nervous system humming even in stillness. These are not mere symptoms. They are messages from the unconscious, expressed through the body because the conscious mind has not yet been able to listen. Jung often said that the psyche communicates symbolically, and the body is one of its oldest symbols. Chronic exhaustion becomes the physical metaphor for a life spent holding too much, too long, too silently. As you move through the world wearing the mantle of capability, something inside you has been waiting, almost breathlessly, for the moment when the facade cracks not to humiliate you, but to liberate you. The crack in the persona is always the beginning of the descent. It is the moment when the ego's tight grip begins to loosen and the deeper layers of the unconscious push upward, insisting on recognition. For many women, this crack arrives through relationships, especially when they notice a recurring pattern that seems to choose them, even when they believe they are choosing differently. You may notice that you attract those who are emotionally unavailable, fragile, chaotic, or wounded, individuals who need rescuing, comforting, organizing, steadying. It is as if you have become fluent in a language that others instinctively seek, the language of emotional labor. You become, without ever intending it, the fixer in friendships, the stabilizer in family, the therapist in romantic relationships. Jung would call this a manifestation of repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate early wounds in hopes of finally mastering them. What the psyche wants is not suffering, it wants resolution, but the unconscious repeats the pattern, not because you failed, but because the inner wound has not yet been seen clearly enough to heal. This explains why giving has often felt like both a duty and a burden, why receiving has felt foreign or even dangerous. Receiving implies need, and need was the one thing you learned early you were not allowed to have. To reach for help once meant finding nothing. To reach for comfort meant stepping into an emotional void. So the psyche learned to armor itself with competence. You became strong not because you wanted strength, but because no other option was available. Still, beneath all the strength, the soul keeps its own counsel. It remembers what was lost. It remembers that your earliest longing was simply to be seen not for your performance, not for your utility, but for your being. That longing never dies. It becomes the quiet ache beneath your successes, the loneliness that persists even in crowded rooms, the hollowness that no achievement can fill. Jung described this as the hunger of the soul, the yearning for resonance. And when that hunger goes unfed, life begins to feel strangely two-dimensional, as if you are present and absent at the same time. This hollow feeling is not a failure. It is an invitation. It is the unconscious knocking at the door, asking you to step into a deeper initiation. Every true psychological transformation begins with a withdrawal from the surface of life, a kind of liminal pause where the ego's habitual strategies no longer work. You may feel lost, disoriented, unsure of what is happening. This is not regression, it is descent. In myth and dream alike, the descent into the underworld always begins with confusion. Something old is dissolving, something new is not yet formed. In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of individuation, the process through which the ego gradually aligns with the deeper self, the inner organizing principle of meaning, purpose, and authenticity. Individuation is not enlightenment. It is not bliss. It is the honest, often painful work of shedding what is false and reclaiming what is true. It begins, paradoxically, with exhaustion, with the realization that you cannot keep living on borrowed energy from a persona that no longer protects you, with the intuition that something within must be faced, the shadow you have kept at bay. The shadow is not the darkness within you. It is everything you had to exile in order to survive. Your rage, your grief, your longing, your ambition, your disappointment, your vulnerability, all buried because the world around you could not hold them. In the next phase, the shadow begins to stir. It wants recognition. It wants air. It wants you. And so the descent continues. The descent into the shadow is never a straight fall. It is more like entering a vast cavern where the air grows thick and old memories echo in the dark. This is the underworld of the psyche, a place Jung described as both frightening and sacred. It is frightening because it contains everything the ego has rejected. It is sacred because it contains everything the soul needs for healing. And for a woman who has lived in chronic strength, the shadow is often filled with the very emotions she learned to forbid: fury, grief, longing, desire, need, exhaustion, and the raw ache of disappointment. They gather here like forgotten gods, waiting to be acknowledged. At first, the encounter feels destabilizing. You may notice sudden irritability you cannot explain, tears that rise without your permission, a heaviness that feels ancient. These feelings do not come from nowhere. They come from the long years during which your inner world was required to stay silent so life could stay functional. The psyche never forgets what was suppressed. It only waits for the moment when you are finally strong enough to feel what you could not feel then. Shadow work, in Jung's understanding, is not a moral cleansing. It is an act of psychic integration. The emotions you fear are not enemies. They are exiled parts of your life force. Rage, especially, carries a misunderstood sacredness. A woman who had to be strong was also a woman who had to swallow anger, to be reasonable, composed, accommodating. But rage is the voice of violated boundaries. It is the inner alarm that says, I have been carrying too much. When rage rises, it does not mean you are broken. It means a truth inside you is waking. Grief, too, emerges, not the surface grief of daily disappointments, but the deep original grief of the child who never got to be small. This grief is not sentimental. It is elemental, like a river that has been dammed for decades, finally pushing through the cracks. As you allow these emotions to surface, not as catastrophes, but as carriers of meaning, something begins to shift. What was once rigid inside you begins to soften. What was once numb begins to feel. You may resist this, fearing that if you let the dam break, you will drown. But the truth is that what threatens to drown you is not the emotion itself. It is the decades of holding it back. A moment comes quiet, unstoppable, when the weight inside you finally brings you to your knees. You weep with a depth you have not touched in years. This is the collapse the ego fears. Yet Jung would say this is the beginning of your liberation. The false strength is breaking. The true strength is emerging. From this inner breaking, another layer becomes visible: the ancestral roots of your wound. The feminine lineage, the mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers who also carried heavy burdens, who were also emotionally neglected, who also were taught to be useful rather than cherished. Jung viewed the psyche as partly personal and partly collective, meaning your suffering does not begin or end with you. The patterns you live inside may belong to generations. When you feel the weight of always being the strong one, you are touching something larger than your own life. You are touching the collective unconscious, where archetypal patterns of the feminine, the caretaker, the self-sacrificing mother, the silent daughter, have shaped women for centuries. This is not about blaming your lineage. It is about seeing its influence. When you look closely, you may recognize echoes of your mother's exhaustion, her unspoken grief, her own unmet needs. You may sense the emotional absence she offered was not a failure of love, but the consequence of her own wound. Jung would say, this is where the mother complex is no longer personal. It becomes an archetype. You're not just healing yourself, you are interrupting a pattern that has been passed down unconsciously. As you descend deeper, another force emerges: the father complex, the part of the psyche shaped by the masculine principle. This is not simply about your literal father. It is about the internalized voice that measures your worth by performance, toughness, competence, and achievement. The masculine within you may have rewarded your persona, the strong one, the capable one, the responsible one, while punishing your softness. To awaken into wholeness, you must loosen your dependence on masculine validation. You must begin to trust a different kind of strength, eros, the creative, intuitive life force that does not push but flows. In the underworld, this new strength stirs. It feels like a faint, glowing ember, something alive that you had forgotten. It will guide the next stage of your journey. There is a turning point in every descent when the darkness stops feeling like a threat and begins to feel like a kind of truth. The myths call this the moment when Persephone stops resisting Hades and starts listening to the underworld. Jung would say that this is the moment when the ego stops fighting the unconscious and begins to cooperate with it. The inner war softens. Something ancient and steady rises from within, not as an idea but as an experience, a quiet sense that the very thing you feared might actually be the key to your freedom. This is where eros begins to awaken. In Jungian psychology, eros is not merely sexual energy. It is the principle of relatedness, creativity, intuition, and emotional depth. It is the feminine life force that knows how to connect rather than control, how to feel rather than suppress, how to listen rather than strategize. When eros stirs, it often arrives gently, a moment of unexpected calm, a breath that feels easier than usual, a sensation of spaciousness in the chest or belly. It may be fleeting, but it is real. It is the first sign that the ego is loosening its rigid grip and allowing the deeper self to make itself known. The self, in Jung's model, is the central organizing principle of the psyche, the inner axis around which meaning, purpose, and authenticity revolve. It is not an ideal self or a perfected version of you. It is the truest core of who you are, untouched by trauma, roles, or expectations. Most people live their whole lives identified with the persona or the wounded ego, but when the self begins to emerge, it does so with a kind of quiet authority. It does not shout, it does not force, it simply reveals. And what it reveals first is that you are more than the strong one, more than the caretaker, more than the woman who holds everything together. This realization often arrives in solitude, not the loneliness that haunted you before, but a new kind of aloneness, alive, warm, luminous. You begin to sense that being alone is not a void, but a sanctuary. You find moments where your own presence feels comforting rather than empty. You start to hear your inner voice again, not the anxious, managerial voice of survival, but a deeper, wiser one that speaks with clarity and compassion. This is the voice of the self, guiding you forward through the final stages of the descent. With this new inner anchor, something extraordinary happens. The outer world begins to reorganize. Relationships shift. People who relied on your endless giving may grow uncomfortable when you stop rescuing them. Some may distance themselves. Others may cling harder. Their reactions are not a reflection of your failure. They are a reflection of the roles the old dynamic required. As you change, the dynamic cannot remain the same. This phase can feel destabilizing, even heartbreaking, but Jung called it a necessary death of the old order. In individuation, anything that was based on inauthenticity must fall away. Yet as the old dissolves, new relationships begin to appear, people who do not need you to shrink or perform, people who are capable of meeting you with reciprocity and presence. These connections feel different, softer, more attuned. It is as if the universe responds to the vibration of your inner changes by sending reflections of the new consciousness you are embodying. Jung believed that this outer mirroring is not coincidence, but synchronicity, the psyche interacting with the world in meaningful alignment. When you shift internally, the world shifts around you. But perhaps the most radical transformation is internal. You begin to discover a dormant capacity, the ability to receive. At first, it feels strange, even threatening. To let someone help, to let someone see your softness, your limits. Your real needs feels like stepping into a dangerous unknown. But every time you allow yourself to receive, you are rewiring your nervous system. You are teaching your psyche that need is not shameful but human, that vulnerability does not lead to abandonment but to intimacy. Slowly, receiving becomes possible, then natural, then beautiful. From this place, new vitality emerges. Jung called this vitality libido not in the narrow sexual sense, but as the psychological energy that fuels imagination, desire, purpose, and creativity. When the false strength dissolves and the true self emerges, libido returns, ideas flow, dreams come alive, desires, long buried, begin to speak. You feel the stirring of a life you have not yet lived. This is the beginning of rebirth, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady and undeniable. You are not the woman you were when this descent began. You are becoming someone deeper, truer, freer. Rebirth is rarely a single moment. It is more like the gradual brightening of a horizon you once assumed would always remain dark. You begin to notice subtle shifts. Your breath arrives more fully. Your body softens in spaces where it once braced, and your inner world, once a battleground, becomes a sanctuary. This quiet unfolding is the essence of individuation, the lifelong process through which the ego aligns with the deeper self. It does not return you to who you were before the wound. It transforms you into someone capable of carrying both wound and wisdom without collapsing beneath either. As this new orientation solidifies, your relationship with strength undergoes its final metamorphosis. Strength no longer means the capacity to endure without breaking. It becomes the capacity to break consciously, to fall apart without abandoning yourself. You learn that tears do not threaten your integrity, they reveal it. You learn that asking for help is not an apology but an act of maturity. You learn that tenderness is not the opposite of strength, it is the completion of it. And as the ego steps aside, the self begins to speak with a clarity that is unmistakable. You do not have to earn your own worth. You never did. From this inner ground, a new kind of sovereignty emerges. It is not the hardened independence that once protected you. It is a spacious, grounded autonomy rooted in self-trust. You begin to navigate life from altitude, seeing patterns in your relationships that once trapped you. You recognize when someone seeks a rescuer rather than a partner. You sense when a boundary is necessary before the violation ever arrives. You stand at the center of your own life, not as a fortress, but as a rooted, gentle, living presence. With this sovereignty comes a new understanding of psychological loneliness. It is not the painful isolation of being unseen. It is the elevated solitude of someone who has met herself at depth. This form of aloneness is not a wound, it is a vantage point. From here, you can see how far you have come. From here, you can breathe in the clarity that was once hidden beneath the noise of performance and survival. And from here, something remarkable happens. Your healing begins to ripple outward into the collective. Jung believed that when one person integrates a complex, a shadow, or an ancestral wound, they do not heal only themselves, they subtly transform the collective unconscious. Every woman who breaks the pattern of self-erasure makes it easier for the next woman to recognize her own voice. Every woman who chooses authenticity over performance expands the psychic territory for all women. You become, without trying, a quiet transmission of permission. Others feel your presence and sense something different, an ease, an honesty, a groundedness. You do not preach it. You embody it. And this embodiment carries you into the final stage, the homecoming. This is the moment when you turn inward and find that the younger version of you, the one who waited in the dark for years, no longer hides. She steps forward, not as a wounded child, but as an integrated part of your being. You hold her not as a burden, but as your origin, your innocence, your truth. The inner division dissolves. The woman you have become and the girl you once were stand in the same light. You realize that all along, the journey was not toward becoming someone new, it was toward remembering who you truly are. Here, The psyche settles, the soul breathes, the self stands unobstructed. And from this depth, a final truth rises simple, enduring, and impossible to forget. You were never meant to survive by being strong. You were meant to live by being whole. If this journey has resonated with you, I invite you to stay connected to this unfolding exploration of Jungian depth psychology, feminine consciousness, and the inner work of becoming. Like, share, subscribe, or comment to continue walking this path together, not as students of theory, but as companions in transformation.